Hey guys, tonight we start by sinking our sandals into dirt, Roman dirt. The kind that once fed millions and then, almost without warning, betrayed them. Picture golden fields shimmering under a Mediterranean sun. Wheat whispering like gossip through the breeze. It feels eternal, doesn't it? Except it wasn't. You're about to see why. And spoiler alert, if you were a farmer in the late Empire, you probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all listening from. It's like our own quiet empire across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking along a crumbling farm track somewhere in North Africa, once Rome's breadbasket, but the soil under your sandals feels powdery, dry like an old parchment. This used to be prime real estate for wheat and olives, the carbs and oils of the ancient world. Now, it's exhausted, overfarmed, stripped bare by centuries of relentless planting with almost no rest for the earth. Romans didn't exactly understand soil chemistry, crop rotation wasn't their thing. Their motto was closer to, plant it, till it quits. Spoiler, it quit. Here's the mainstream fact, by the 3rd and 4th centuries, regions like North Africa and Sicily were failing to deliver the bumper harvests Rome relied on. Combine that with pressure to feed an empire-sized mouth, and the state leaned harder on provincial farmers. Taxes in grain rose even as yields dropped. It's the ancient equivalent of your boss demanding more hours while cutting your paycheck. Now let's toss in a quirky tidbit. Some historians argue the obsession with exporting grain to feed Rome itself, like a spoiled city child, wrecked local economies. Farmers in Egypt or Africa couldn't prioritize local needs because the capital had to eat. Imagine sending your best produce across the sea while your own village chewed stale barley. It's the ancient version of influencers hoarding toilet paper during a shortage. But soil fatigue was just the start. Overgrazing by herds, deforestation for shipbuilding, and plain old erosion turned fertile plains into dust bowls. You can almost feel that grit in your teeth as you trudge along. Wind hissing through dead stalks. The empire's agricultural backbone was literally snapping, vertebra by vertebra. And here's a question scholars still wrestle with: was this collapse purely environmental, or was it political negligence? Some argue that Rome had the means to innovate. Simple fixes like crop rotation or manuring could have helped. But those cost money, and landowners preferred short-term profit. Why invest in sustainability when you can buy another villa with your wheat profits now? Sounds familiar, right? As fields failed, the human fallout began. Rural depopulation kicked in. Farmers abandoned the land, some running to cities, others joining the swelling ranks of the desperate. The empire tried to lock them down with harsh laws, binding peasants to their plots, a preview of medieval serfdom. It's not a coincidence that words like colonist morph into the roots of colonial and colony. Rome was colonizing its own countryside, turning free men into agricultural prisoners. You glance back at that dead field and picture the invisible chain: barren soil, right-pointing arrow; failed harvest, right-pointing arrow; famine, right-pointing arrow; tax collapse, right-pointing arrow; military weakness. A domino line stretching all the way to the Forum. Think of it like a modern supply chain failure, except instead of delayed Amazon deliveries, you've got legions starving and provinces rebelling. And because Rome loved bureaucracy almost as much as gladiators, they doubled down on paperwork instead of soil care. Edicts flew across the empire, demanding more grain, fixing prices, punishing hoarders. But you can't legislate fertility back into the earth. No law, no emperor, not even a particularly stern centurion could bully seeds into sprouting where nutrients had vanished. The irony: Rome once bragged about making deserts bloom. Remember those propaganda mosaics of lush farms, fat cattle, and olive groves stretching to the horizon? By the late Empire, those same landscapes were coughing dust. It's a bit like posting gym selfies when you've secretly cancelled your membership. One more thing, climate nudged this process along. We'll dive deeper in a later section, but minor shifts, cooler temps, erratic rains, magnified human mistakes. Nature didn't kill Rome, but like a sly accomplice, it helped shove the empire toward the edge. You pause on the track, the sun dropping low, air thick with that dry, bitter scent of failed harvests. Imagine being a farmer then, no soil science podcasts, no government bailout, just hunger and the vague hope your kids won't be drafted to die for an empire that's bleeding from the roots up. Funny thought, historians often glamorize the fall of Rome with big battles and barbarian hordes. But in reality, it might have started with something as humble as a tired patch of ground giving up the fight. So next time someone says, the Roman Empire didn't fall overnight, picture this, a handful of dirt, crumbling through your fingers, centuries before the last emperor lost his throne. You're standing in an opulent Roman dining room now, walls dripping with frescoes, the floor glinting with tiny mosaic tiles, and a table laid out with delicacies so rich they practically wink at you. There's a silver goblet in your hand, and when you take a sip of that sweet, honeyed wine, well, congratulations. You've just dosed yourself with lead. Yes, actual lead. Welcome to one of Rome's quietest killers. See, the Romans adored their plumbing system. Aqueducts, baths, fountains, those were the flex posts of antiquity. And they built those systems with pipes made of lead. Plumbum in Latin, which is where we get the word plumbing. Cute etymology, deadly reality. Now, here's the mainstream fact. Extensive use of lead in pipes and cookware was widespread in Rome. Wealthy homes boasted lead pipes, while the common folk drank from clay or wooden conduits. You'd think that gave the poor an advantage. But we'll get there. And it wasn't just water. Romans had a sweet tooth, or maybe a sweet palate, and they didn't have refined sugar. So, they used a syrup called sapa, made by boiling grape juice in lead pots. The lead leached in, turning sapa into a toxic cocktail. Historians estimate that the aristocracy, the elite decision-makers of the empire, might have ingested astonishing levels of lead over their lifetimes. Imagine senators debating foreign policy while quietly battling neurological issues. Honestly, that explains a lot about late imperial politics. Now, the quirky tidbit. Some researchers think chronic lead poisoning made emperors, and their courts, erratic. Was Caligula's legendary madness a personality quirk? Or the slow burn of heavy metal in his brain? Historians still argue whether lead toxicity significantly shaped Roman politics or if that theory is oversold. Some even call it a historical myth with a grain of truth, or should I say, a goblet of poisoned wine. But here's where the nuance kicks in. Modern studies suggest Roman water wasn't as heavily contaminated as once believed. Flowing water doesn't cling to lead like a possessive ex. Still, elite households, obsessed with syrupy wine and intricate plumbing, probably dose themselves daily. Combine that with cosmetics, pottery glazes, and pigments rich in lead. Yes, ladies and gents, your beauty routine could kill you, and you've got a society marinating in metal. Picture yourself lounging in a marble bath. Steam rises, scented oils swell, and as you relax, you're soaking in water that's been piped through miles of lead. Your pores open, your body sighs, and in goes the poison. It's the ancient equivalent of a spa treatment with a side of neurotoxin. And the effect wasn't instant. Oh no. That would have been too obvious. Lead poisoning works like a patient villain. It clouds your mind, muddles memory, weakens bones, and tanks fertility. Roman birth rates were already dipping. And while that wasn't entirely due to lead, it didn't help. Imagine trying to run an empire when your ruling class keeps producing fewer heirs and more erratic policies. Of course, this is where scholarly debates get spicy. Was lead a major culprit in Rome's decline or just a footnote? Some argue that concentrations in bones and soil samples from ancient sites indicate chronic exposure. Others say the levels were too low to cause widespread collapse. Either way, it's hard to ignore the symbolic irony. The empire famous for engineering brilliance built a silent hazard into its own infrastructure. And because we can't resist an aside, Romans actually bragged about the taste lead gave water and wine. They thought it was smooth, refined. Can you imagine a sommelier today saying, "Ah yes, a hint of plum, and a lovely undertone of plumbing material"? Cheers to that. Now, widen the frame. What does this tell us about Rome? It's the story of a society obsessed with luxury, so enamored with its innovations that it didn't question the hidden costs. They didn't have the science, sure, but they had plenty of warning signs: mysterious illnesses, fragile bones, infertility among the rich. And still, they doubled down because status greater than survival. That mindset, timeless. Swap lead pipes for social media algorithms and tell me we've changed. The scene shifts. You're leaving the villa, walking past a fountain burbling in the moonlight. The water sparkles like liquid silver. It's gorgeous and deadly. That fountain is the empire in miniature, elegant on the surface, quietly poisoning itself beneath. And just like that, the lead that promised progress whispers decline into Rome's veins. One goblet, one bath, one luxury improvement at a time. So next time someone gushes about Roman engineering, remember this: the genius came with a toxic asterisk. Progress isn't always clean, and sometimes the most advanced societies are the ones quietly building their own traps. Drink to that, just maybe not from a lead cup. You're in a Roman marketplace now, and the air feels heavy, not with the scent of olives and fresh bread, but with the metallic clang of coins changing hands. Only these coins aren't what they used to be. Once, Rome's denarius gleamed with silver so pure it could almost blind you in sunlight. Now, the thing in your palm looks tired, dull, and suspiciously lightweight, like someone swapped your favorite brand coffee for decaf. Welcome to the world of debased currency and financial illusion. The slow bleed of an empire's wallet. Here's the mainstream fact: by the 3rd century CE, Rome was in deep fiscal trouble. Endless wars, border defenses, lavish games, imperial palaces. It was like running the most expensive theme park in history without an exit strategy. When the state's appetite outpaced its income, emperors turned to a classic trick: cut the silver content in coins. Early denarii, around 95% silver. By the time of the crisis of the 3rd century, barely a silver cameo, just a thin plating on a base metal heart. You'd need a magnifying glass and a very forgiving accountant to call it currency. Now, here's the quirky tidbit: Roman citizens weren't entirely clueless. People tested coins by biting them, a weird tradition that's part of why you still see cartoon characters chomping gold coins today. If you tried biting one of these debased denarii, though, your dentist would have retired early. Inside was mostly bronze or copper. Imagine discovering your paycheck is now Monopoly money. Except you can't even flip it on eBay because everyone else knows it too. Historians still argue whether this rampant debasement was the real trigger for Rome's inflation spiral or just one symptom among many. Some think coin quality dropped so hard that trust in currency flatlined, forcing people back into barter. Others say Rome's economy was too complex for coinage alone to tank it. But walk through this marketplace with me. Merchants huddle, whispering, weighing coins like paranoid jewelers. Prices leap like startled deer. Yesterday's loaf of bread costs 2 coins. Today, it's 5. Tomorrow, you may need a sackful. Inflation wasn't just a buzzword. It was a daily gut punch. And this wasn't just about buying grapes for dinner. Military payroll, Rome's ultimate expense, depended on coins. When soldiers realized their pay was slipping into junk metal territory, loyalty cracked. You can't buy unwavering allegiance with coins that look like bottle caps. Cue mutinies, coups, and the delightful spectacle of emperors racing to outbid each other for army love. That bidding war drained treasuries faster than a college kid drains energy drinks during finals. Picture this, emperor after emperor sitting in a marble hall, scribbling decrees to mint more coins while secretly knowing each new batch buys less real stuff. It's the ancient version of, just print more money, except instead of a press, you've got enslaved mint workers hammering out desperation. They even gave the coin a new name, the Antoninianus, because nothing says economic stability like rebranding your failing currency. Spoiler, it didn't help. Here's the kicker, as coins lost credibility, the empire tried to enforce fixed prices by law. The infamous edict on maximum prices by Diocletian in 301 CE slapped ceilings on everything from grain to gladiators. Sounds good in theory, stop inflation by decree, but in practice, a black market boom and merchants vanishing like socks in a dryer. You can almost hear Diocletian sigh as his paperwork empire collapses under the weight of its own wishful thinking. And while all this is happening, tax collectors crank up the pressure. With cash losing value, the state increasingly demanded taxes in kind, grain, livestock, labor. That's right, we're back to a barter economy under an empire that once flaunted its monetary sophistication. It's like seeing your favorite tech giant suddenly trade stock options for goats. You wander out of the marketplace now, your coin pouch feeling heavier but somehow worthless. In the distance, you hear the rhythmic clang of the mints, pounding out another round of fake silver dreams. Rome, once the financial envy of the world, is caught in a paradox, an economy so vast and bureaucratic it can't collapse neatly, so it crumbles slowly. Like a loaf of bread left in the sun. The irony, Roman propaganda still bragged about abundance. Statues glittered, forums bustled, amphitheaters roared with games funded by the very currency rot eating through the system. On the surface, splendor. Underneath, a hollow economy running on fumes and denial. And just when you think it can't get messier, consider this, soldiers, desperate for stability, start proclaiming their generals as emperors, promising better pay. Those civil wars aren't free, by the way. They're funded with, you guessed it, more bad money. The snake isn't just eating its tail, it's choking on the bones. So, next time someone says, Rome fell because of barbarian invasions, smile gently and picture this, an empire undone by something as small and shiny as a coin, melting down in sweaty palms long before the first barbarian ever saw the gates. You leave the clamor of the marketplace and drift toward a temple square glowing in the evening light. Incense curls upward, bells chime softly, and every corner of this plaza is alive with prayer. Not one temple, dozens. A shrine to Jupiter here, a modest altar to Isis there, and down the colonnaded street, a congregation whispering hymns to some new god on the block named Christos. Welcome to a Rome so religiously crowded it feels like a cosmic potluck. And yes, someone's about to argue over whose dish is sacred. Here's the mainstream fact. The Roman Empire started with a solid civic religion, state rituals, sacrifices to Jupiter, festivals honoring the gods who, supposedly, kept Rome safe. It wasn't exactly personal, it was practical. Like paying spiritual taxes. But as the empire ballooned, so did its divine guest list. Egyptians brought Isis, Persians brought Mithras, Jews clung to Yahweh, and Christians eventually crashed the party with their one-god rule. Rome didn't mind diversity at first, worship whoever, just also salute Jupiter, but eventually, that easygoing vibe cracked. Now, the quirky tidbit, Roman officials actually issued little certificates, libelli, proving you'd sacrificed to the imperial cult. Think of it as an ancient hall pass for religious compliance. No certificate, enjoy a date with the local magistrate, or worse. The arena. Imagine holding a slip of parchment that decides whether you go home for dinner or become Lion Chow. Talk about paperwork pressure. Historians still argue whether this religious fragmentation truly destabilized the empire or just reflected deeper issues. Some say it eroded the shared identity, Romanitas, that glued the empire together. Others think it was a symptom, not a cause, of Rome's bigger problems. But standing here in this temple square, you can feel the tension humming like a plucked lyre string. Picture a senator striding past with a sneer, "These Christians refuse the gods." Bad omen for Rome. Meanwhile, a Christian baker mutters, "Your god's a stone, mine hears me." Add to that mystery cult initiates promising salvation, astrologers selling star charts, and philosophers debating over wine. It's spiritual chaos, and everyone's invited, except harmony. And here's where politics crashes the party. Emperors used religion like duct tape, slapping it over cracks to hold the empire together. The imperial cult demanded loyalty sacrifices not because Jupiter needed snacks but because the state needed symbolic obedience. When Christians refused, it wasn't just stubborn faith, it looked like treason. Cue persecutions, martyrdoms, and PR disasters. Spoiler: killing people for praying differently rarely boosts morale. You wander deeper into the square, passing a temple where priests of Cybele bang drums while devotees dance barefoot in ecstatic frenzy. Across the way, Mithraic initiates huddle in shadowy chambers under tauroctony reliefs, Mithras slaying a bull as stars twinkle on the ceiling. Meanwhile, Christians meet in secret, sharing bread and whispers about a kingdom not of this world. It's spiritual jazz, everyone improvising. No conductor in sight. Now, let's talk identity. Rome once prided itself on being a Pax Deorum powerhouse, a state in cosmic harmony because everyone played by the divine rulebook. But by the 4th century, that rulebook was shredded. Even the emperors couldn't pick a lane. Constantine legalized Christianity, then built churches while still honoring Sol Invictus. Theodosius later made Christianity official, flipping the script entirely. Imagine being a pagan priest one decade, then watching your temple stripped for church marble the next. That whiplash wasn't just cultural, it was civic. The cost? Cohesion. When your empire stretches from misty Britain to sunburned Egypt, you need a unifying story. Rome's old tale, "We conquer with Jupiter's blessing," fizzled when half the population thought Jupiter was yesterday's news. And Christians weren't just anti-sacrifice, they were anti-theater, anti-games, anti-most fun things in Rome. Picture shutting down the Colosseum in a city addicted to spectacle. Awkward. Here's a fun aside. Some elites joined Christianity like modern influencers hopping trends, because that's where power was heading. Others clung to old gods out of nostalgia, scribbling bitter poetry about the good old days when men were men and Jupiter still mattered. It's basically Facebook threads, but with togas. And don't forget the fringe effects. Temple revenues tanked, festivals dwindled, priestly roles vanished. These weren't just spiritual losses, they gutted local economies and social safety nets, which temples once supported. Suddenly, the empire wasn't just religiously fragmented, its charitable spine cracked. You step back from the square now. Behind you, temple doors creak shut. Ahead, you glimpse a cross glinting on a hill. The old gods are packing their bags while the new faith sketches blueprints for cathedrals. Rome, the empire of everyone welcome, is learning the hard truth. Too many gods at dinner makes for one messy table, and sooner or later, someone flips it. So, was this the fatal blow? Maybe not alone, but like lead in the pipes and silver in the wind, religious fracturing seeped quietly, corroding trust, identity, and the rituals that once bound Rome like mortar between bricks. And when the mortar crumbles, the walls don't stand long. You're walking along a grand avenue now, colonnades gleaming in late sunlight, statues of past heroes looming like silent reminders. But look closer, beneath the marble polish, Something feels stuck, like a city trying to dance while shackled in iron. Rome once thrived on adaptability, now it clings to old habits like a cat to a shredded sofa. Welcome to the lost art of adaptation, the quiet rigidity that turned the empire brittle in a world that demanded flexibility. Here's the mainstream fact: Rome's early strength came from its genius for borrowing, Etruscan archers, Greek art, Carthaginian ships. But by the late empire, that creative streak fizzled. Instead of evolving, Rome doubled down on tradition. Military tactics, social structures, even fashion stayed frozen while enemies experimented. Meanwhile, bureaucracy ballooned like an overfed python, smothering innovation under layers of wax tablets and imperial stamps. Now, the quirky tidbit: some scholars argue Romans invented planned obsolescence, but for ideas. Military manuals recycled strategies from centuries past, even as Germanic cavalry and Persian cataphracts galloped circles around them. Imagine generals obsessing over phalanxes while the battlefield screams, "Hello, horse archers." It's the ancient equivalent of sending fax machines to fight Wi-Fi. Historians still argue whether Rome's conservatism was cultural pride or survival instinct. Did clinging to old ways hold the empire together longer, or pull it down faster? That's the dinner table debate in academic circles. But as you stroll this avenue, you see the cracks: men in senatorial robes sneering at merchants with newfangled ideas. Engineers sidelined because their designs feel too Greek. Artisans told, if it was good enough for Augustus, it's good enough for you. Progress wasn't dead, but it was shackled, gagged, and stuffed in a storage closet. Let's zoom in on the army. Rome's pride and eventual problem. Early Rome loved discipline and adaptability. Heck, they borrowed the gladius from Iberia and siege engines from Syria. But by the late empire, reforms limped along behind reality. Heavy infantry still hogged the spotlight, even as light cavalry became the future. When reforms came, like using more mounted troops, they were too little, too late, and often sabotaged by politics. Generals feared innovation because failure meant execution. Not a stern memo. Risk-taking, no thanks. And it wasn't just war. Agriculture stagnated, remember that soil from Section 1. Technology crawled, and industries stayed stuck in artisanal mode while rivals leaned into mechanization. Water wheels, Rome had them, sure, but did they mass produce goods? Not really. They preferred muscle over machinery, tradition over transformation. Why gamble on a tech leap when you can squeeze one more grain tax from a starving province? Here's a modern parallel. Picture a giant corporation too bloated to pivot, strangled by red tape. It's board obsessed with heritage branding, while competitors launch sleek new startups. Rome was that company, bragging about its legacy as market share slipped away. The empire loved its image of eternal order, so much so that it mistook rigidity for strength. Spoiler: rigidity snaps under stress. And oh, the bureaucracy. By the 4th century, layers of officials multiplied like rabbits in togas. Governors, sub-governors, secretaries, auditors. The payroll read like a scroll that never ends. Every innovation had to crawl through this swamp of approvals. Want to build a new road with a clever design? First, petition the local curator, then wait 6 months for a reply from Ravenna, assuming your courier doesn't get robbed or eaten by wolves. By then, winter's here, your workers are gone, and your brilliant plan is lining a pigeon coop. Here's a fun aside: some emperors tried to cut through the red tape with grand reforms, but those often spiraled into chaos. Diocletian's Tetrarchy, a bold move to stabilize leadership. Within decades, it was a soap opera of backstabbing Caesars. Innovation wasn't impossible in Rome, it was just painfully expensive, politically dangerous, and often doomed by infighting. Now imagine standing at a construction site. Workers chip away at marble, crafting yet another triumphal arch to commemorate yet another emperor. Meanwhile, the empire can't figure out better plows, improved storage methods, or efficient tax systems. It's as if Rome decided, who needs progress when we have pretty arches? The result? A glittering facade masking systemic stagnation. And here's the bitter irony, Rome thought tradition was its anchor. In truth, it became a millstone. The empire worshipped its own golden past so much that it forgot the future doesn't wait politely. So when crises hit, climate shifts, plagues, barbarian migrations, Rome reacted like a rusty hinge, too stiff, too slow, and far too proud to call the locksmith. You stroll past the last colonnade, marble glowing in sunset hues. Behind you, statues of old heroes gaze down with stone eyes. Their frozen pose is a perfect metaphor. Rome didn't die because it lacked greatness. It died because it couldn't let greatness evolve. And in a world where survival favors the quick and the clever, being the biggest, oldest player wasn't enough. So next time you hear, all roads lead to Rome, remember, they did, but Rome never built the road to tomorrow. You're moving now through the shadowy corridors of a Roman governor's villa. Wax tablets lie scattered on a desk, their messages scratched in Latin shorthand. Half-finished dispatches waiting for couriers who may never come. Out in the courtyard, a horse snorts impatiently, its rider yawning under a pale moon. This, right here, is where Rome's veins of power begin to clot. The empire once prided itself on lightning-fast orders and military precision. But by the later centuries, communication and data collapsed like a soggy scroll left in the rain. Here's the mainstream fact: Rome's administration depended on reliable information flow. Orders from emperors had to reach distant governors, and reports from provinces needed to race back to the capital. In the glory days, they managed this through a system called the Cursus Publicus, a state-run postal network with relay stations and fresh horses. Like FedEx in sandals. But as the empire grew unwieldy and coffers ran dry, that sleek machine rusted, relay posts disappeared, horses starved, bribes replaced efficiency, and urgent messages often crawled slower than a senator on siesta. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some historians argue provincial governors sometimes learned about new emperors weeks after their coronation, or worse, after their assassination. Imagine governing a frontier city, declaring loyalty to Emperor X and then finding out Emperor X was assassinated 2 months ago and you're now technically a traitor. Talk about awkward dinner parties. Historians still argue whether this breakdown was just logistical strain or deliberate sabotage. Corruption certainly played its part. Officials padded expenses, pocketed courier funds, or lost messages that weren't worth their while. Want a letter to arrive fast? Pay up, otherwise, it might linger in a dusty saddlebag until your crisis becomes a catastrophe. You picture the empire's command system like a nervous system, except now the signals misfire. A barbarian raid sparks on the Rhine frontier. Local commanders light signal fires, scribble reports, and send riders galloping east. But by the time the news limps into Ravenna or Constantinople, the raiders are gone, villages burned to ash, and the survivors are trudging toward refugee camps. Rome reacts like an elderly giant, swinging at ghosts weeks too late. And this isn't just about soldiers. Grain shortages, tax riots, plagues, every crisis relied on timely intel. But without real-time updates, or even consistent monthly updates, governors improvised, sometimes inventing data to avoid imperial wrath. Yes, Augustus. The harvest was splendid. Meanwhile, their storehouses echo like empty amphitheaters. When reality finally surfaced, it was usually mid-disaster. Here's an aside. Imagine trying to manage a TikTok account with 6-month upload delays. That's Rome in the 4th century. Slow feedback loops, zero agility, drowning in lag. The failure wasn't just speed, it was accuracy. Messages passed through layers of scribes, interpreters, and couriers, each prone to error or embellishment. A border skirmish could morph into full-scale invasion by the time it reached the emperor, or worse. Get minimized to minor disturbance to keep officials' heads attached. You're basically running an empire on a game of telephone. Except the stakes are millions of lives and the punchline is civil war. Even technology betrayed them. Papyrus rotted fast. Parchment was pricey. And archives burned or were pilfered during coups. Entire chains of commands sometimes vanished in smoke. One historian noted that by the 5th century, emperors were practically blind, ruling through rumor and guesswork. That's not governance, that's gambling with marble dice. And the postal failure fed corruption like a gourmet feast. Provincial elites knew they could fudge tax reports or delay tribute payments because Rome simply couldn't verify the truth in time. The empire's famous law machine sputtered when edicts took months to arrive. Justice delayed. Try justice so late it shows up wearing a toga 2 emperors out of date. Now imagine yourself as a legionary on the Danube frontier. You're freezing, hungry, rumors of barbarian hordes swirl, and your pay is 3 months late because someone misplaced the courier pouch. You don't need a historian to guess what happens next: desertion, mutiny, or selling your sword to the highest bidder. And the state wonders why loyalty keeps evaporating. Here's the irony that makes you smirk. Rome built roads like veins across the empire, 25.000 miles of engineering brilliance, yet in its final centuries, those roads carried gossip better than government. You step out of that villa now, the night wind tugging at your cloak. Behind you, wax tablets lie abandoned, the last words of an official who thought his message might matter. Above, the stars glitter, indifferent to human bureaucracy. Rome's weakness wasn't just at the frontiers, it seeped through the paper trails and courier routes. A silent entropy eating the empire from within. So next time you marvel at Roman roads, remember this: the hardware stayed brilliant, but the software, the human system, crashed spectacularly. And when an empire can't talk to itself, it doesn't matter how loud it shouts. You feel the first chill before you see the signs. The vineyards look patchy, their leaves brittle, and the river nearby runs low, sulking between cracked banks. Somewhere in the distance, thunder grumbles, not the kind that promises rain, but the dry whisper of storms that never quite arrive. Welcome to the subtle sabotage of climate. The quiet hand that tugged at Rome's threads until the whole tapestry sagged. Here's the mainstream fact: Rome's prime centuries coincided with what climatologists now call the Roman climate optimum, a warm, stable period that made Mediterranean agriculture purr like a spoiled cat. Wheat in Africa, olives in Spain, wine in Gaul, it all flowed smoothly into Rome's belly. But around the late 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, patterns shifted, rainfall faltered, winters nipped harder, and the climate slid into what scholars dub the late antique Little Ice Age. It wasn't an apocalypse, but for an empire addicted to predictable harvests, it was like pulling the tablecloth under a feast. Now, for a quirky tidbit, tree ring data from ancient oaks and ice cores from Greenland whisper the same story: cold snaps, weird drought cycles, and even a volcanic hiccup or two. Some historians link these shifts to grain shortages that sparked riots in Rome. Imagine queuing for bread under a burning sun, only to find the granaries echo like empty cathedrals. People didn't tweet their rage back then, they torched bakeries instead. Historians still argue whether climate was a prime mover or just background noise amplifying other disasters. One camp insists it was the domino that started the fall. Another shrugs. Bad weather happens. But pause here with me, toes crunching over parched soil, and feel the tension when your entire economy, tax base, and army feed depend on agriculture. Even small weather tantrums hit like a battering ram. Picture this: North African fields that once carpeted the empire in grain now cough up dust. Rivers shrink, making transport sluggish and mills useless. Herds die because pastureland turns brown. And Rome, stubborn as ever, refuses to adjust. Instead of diversifying crops or reforming food distribution, the state tightens tax screws on farmers already on their knees. That's like telling a drowning man, swim harder. Spoiler, he sinks. And famine doesn't travel alone, it brings friends. Malnutrition softens bodies for disease. Unrest flares like tinder, and migrations gather momentum. Hungry tribes on the empire's fringes push inward. Not because they woke up craving conquest, but because winter burned the granaries. By the time those barbarian invasions hit the headlines of history, their roots often trace back to a failed harvest. Here's an aside for perspective. Imagine modern cities after 3 years of catastrophic crop failures. Grocery stores stripped, prices sky high, governments fumbling with ration cards. Now delete global trade networks and refrigerated ships. That's Rome, locked in its Mediterranean bubble, praying to Jupiter while clouds laugh in Latin. And the weather mood swings didn't just stay local. Drought in one province meant tax collapse, which starved the military budget, which left frontiers weak. Floods elsewhere wrecked roads and aqueducts, so relief grain couldn't move. Each hiccup in nature became a choke point in Rome's delicate supply web. Then came the whispers of something stranger, famines paired with odd atmospheric veils. Likely volcanic fallout. Imagine waking to a sun dimmed behind a dusty veil, crops stunted by cold, and priests fumbling for omens. You'd think the gods were angry, and Rome believed just that, scrambling to appease them with rituals that couldn't stop tectonic tantrums. Here's the bitter punchline: the empire that tamed rivers with aqueducts and carved roads across mountains thought it had nature on a leash. Turns out, climate doesn't negotiate. Rome's glory years were built on borrowed weather luck. And when the bill came due, it didn't arrive politely. You turn now from the cracked fields, eyes tracing the horizon where once green hills blur into grey. Picture caravans of farmers trudging away, shoulders bent, villagers hollowing like skulls. Their footsteps drum the same dirge across the empire. Hunger breeds chaos. Chaos invites collapse. So, when someone insists the fall of Rome was all politics and barbarians, whisper this: sometimes history pivots on something as simple as rain, or the lack of it. And no legion, no law, no marble god could march against the sky. You're standing in the hum of a Roman city now, a place where marble colonnades frame bustling streets. Chatter spills from taverns, and somewhere nearby, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith competes with the shrill cry of a fishmonger. But listen closely, beneath the noise of commerce, there's a quieter, more troubling rhythm, a labor force stretched to its breaking point. Welcome to Rome's workforce crisis, where dependence on slavery, economic stagnation, and cultural disdain for honest labor twisted the empire into knots it couldn't untangle. Here's the mainstream fact: Rome ran on slave power. From the sprawling latifundia in Sicily to the villas of Campania, enslaved labor kept the wheels of agriculture, industry, and domestic life spinning. Victorious wars once funneled a steady stream of human chattel into the system. But when expansion slowed, and conquests turned into defensive wars, that stream thinned to a trickle. The empire now faced a math problem it never solved: fewer slaves, higher costs, and no plan B. Now for a quirky tidbit: Roman elites considered manual labor beneath their dignity. Farming, crafting, hauling bricks, these were servile tasks, best left to slaves. Free citizens aspired to political clout, military glory, or maybe tax collection if ambition fizzled. Honest work, that was for Greeks and other people you could sneer at over wine. Picture an aristocrat looking at a plow like it's a cursed artifact. Historians still argue whether this cultural snobbery doomed Rome's economy or if structural issues, like taxation and demographics, were the bigger culprits. But as you stroll through this city, you see the symptoms everywhere. Huge estates swallow small farms. run by gangs of slaves whose morale is somewhere south of miserable. Urban plebs crowd into insulae, scraping by on handouts because jobs are scarce and poorly paid. Meanwhile, trades stagnate because Rome never developed a true middle class with dignity in work. Imagine a city of 1 million people where most citizens rely on grain doles, those famous Annona handouts, just to avoid riots. The state buys loyalty with bread, but it's a fragile bargain. When the ships run late or storms wreck a grain fleet, hunger riots ignite like dry straw, and with work devalued, few have the skills or mindset to pivot. Rome's labor culture calcified into entitlement at the bottom and decadence at the top. Here's the irony: technological innovation could have eased the crisis. Watermills existed, harvesting tools existed, but why invest in machines when you can buy another slave, at least when the supply lasted? That mindset stunted productivity. By the late Empire, when slaves grew scarce and expensive, the system faltered, farms shrank, output dropped, and rural economies imploded. The empire tried binding coloni, tenant farmers, to the land. A desperate legal patch that foreshadowed medieval serfdom. But laws can't conjure productivity from exhausted soil and bitter hearts. And don't forget the military drag. Recruiting soldiers from a population allergic to labor was like fishing in a dry pond. Many citizens dodged service outright, bribing officials or mutilating themselves to avoid conscription. Rome increasingly relied on barbarian foederati, foreign fighters who saw Rome less as a homeland and more as a paycheck. Spoiler, that'll matter in a few sections. Want an image? Picture the empire as a massive machine powered by human cogs. At its peak, the gears whirred smoothly. Now, the supply of cogs is shrinking. Some are cracked, others refuse to turn, and still, the overseers keep cranking the levers harder. It's not sustainable. Here's an aside for fun. Roman satirists loved mocking the idle elite who spent afternoons gossiping in baths while lecturing about virtue. Imagine a senator lounging on a marble bench, wagging his finger about moral decay while sipping spiced wine, paid for by slaves harvesting grapes under a pitiless sun. If hypocrisy were currency, Rome could have funded 10 more legions. And when crisis hit, plagues, famines, invasions, the brittle labor system shattered faster than a cheap amphora. With no cultural respect for adaptive work and no fallback when slavery dried up, Rome's economic skeleton simply couldn't support its imperial bulk. Add in crushing taxes on those still producing, and you have peasants abandoning land in droves. Whole villages ghosting the state like a bad date. You leave the city street now, stepping into the glow of a torchlit forum. Statues cast long shadows across cracked paving stones. Once, this empire boasted it could outlast time itself. But even time can smell weakness, and tonight, it smells like sweat, hunger, and a system so proud of its chains it forgot to forge keys for the future. So, the next time someone imagines Rome falling with a clash of swords, remember this: part of the collapse began in silence. In fields gone empty, in workshops that never opened, in hands that forgot how to work, because someone told them work was shameful. The night is cooler now as you leave the torchlit forum and follow the rumble of hooves echoing down a cobbled road. Out of the gloom, a column of cavalry appears, their cloaks whipping in the wind, crested helmets catching stray moonlight. But look closer, these aren't Romans. Not really. Their speech is harsh and guttural, their shields painted with strange symbols. And their loyalty, let's just say it's negotiable. Welcome to the rise of mercenary armies. The subtle shift that turned Rome's sword arm into a rented limb. Here's the mainstream fact. For centuries, the legions were Rome's backbone, disciplined citizen soldiers in shining larica segmentata, marching under the eagle with terrifying unity. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, that image belonged in a museum. The legions grew thin as plagues. Economic decline and draft dodging drained manpower. Citizens dodged service like it was a bad date. So Rome turned to outsiders, Goths, Vandals, Franks, barbarians who once stormed its borders now wore its uniforms. Now for a quirky tidbit, some of these foederati, allied troops, signed contracts guaranteeing land inside the empire in exchange for service. Sounds practical, until you realize it's like hiring a bodyguard who moves into your guest room and starts redecorating. Fast forward a century, and those guests own half the house. Historians still argue whether barbarian recruitment was a masterstroke of pragmatism or the empire's biggest own goal. Some say it bought Rome precious decades of survival. Others claim it sowed the seeds of collapse by eroding military cohesion. Either way, the dynamic was messy. Roman officers commanded units that spoke 10 dialects, fought with mixed tactics, and sometimes had more loyalty to their tribal chiefs than to the emperor. Imagine trying to run a team where half your players don't know the playbook and the other half secretly hope the coach gets fired. And loyalty wasn't just fragile, it was transactional. Pay the foederati well, and they fought like lions. Miss a paycheck, and suddenly they're on break while your frontier burns. Worse, some mercenary leaders played kingmaker, switching sides or demanding fiefdoms as bargaining chips. Think of Stilicho, a general of Vandal descent who basically ran Western Rome like his personal startup before being executed for alleged treason. Spoiler, killing your best commander rarely stabilizes things. Now picture a late Roman battlefield. Gone are the gleaming maniples of old. Instead, you've got patchwork units, Roman veterans, Germanic cavalry, archers from the east, thrown together under banners that feel more symbolic than binding. The discipline that once made legions unstoppable erodes into improvisation and infighting. When orders clash with tribal loyalties, guess which wins? Here's the bitter irony. The empire that once prided itself on Romanizing outsiders ended up Romanized by its own recruits, or rather, not Romanized enough. These soldiers brought their own customs, their own ambitions, and sometimes, their entire families. Whole tribes crossed the frontiers under the guise of alliances, setting up camp inside imperial borders like squatters with swords. Rome's army became a revolving door of cultures, fascinating for an anthropologist, fatal for cohesion, and the stakes, catastrophic. When mercenary leaders decided their paycheck wasn't worth the risk, they didn't just quit, they turned on Rome. The Visigoths who sacked the Eternal City in 410 CE. Once foederati, the Vandals who carved out North Africa, former auxiliaries. Rome wasn't conquered by strangers, it was eaten from the inside by friends. Here's an aside to lighten the doom. Imagine if your home security team started hosting parties in your living room. Then changed the locks. That's basically the 5th century Western Empire. By now, you're following the cavalry column as it veers toward a frontier fort. Fires glow along the ramparts, and the watchmen look uneasy. They've heard rumors, raids in Gaul, mutinies in Pannonia, whispers that some allied troops are eyeing the treasury like kids eyeing a cookie jar. The empire's defenses stand, but barely, propped up by men whose swords might point inward tomorrow. So next time someone says Rome fell to barbarians, nod and add this: many of those barbarians were on the payroll first. Rome didn't just lose to outsiders, it outsourced its own security until the invoices came due, and the collectors brought armies. You leave the frontier camp behind, the night wind biting harder as you follow a narrow road winding toward a misty river valley. In the distance, silhouettes of thatched roofs cluster under a pale moon, smoke curling from chimneys like whispers. These aren't Roman villas, they're barbarian villages. Simple yet stubborn, dotting the empire's fringes like seeds waiting for cracks in the pavement. Welcome to the migration storms. The human tide Rome thought it could channel, only to drown in its wake. Here's the mainstream fact: by the late 4th and 5th centuries CE, huge waves of people pressed against Rome's borders, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Alans, Franks, Lombards, Huns, and a few other tribes whose names sound like heavy metal bands. They weren't just raiders, many were refugees, fleeing an even bigger nightmare barreling from the east, the Huns. When the Gothic king Fritigern begged Rome for asylum in 376, it wasn't conquest he sought, it was survival. The Danube froze, the tribes crossed, and history's dominoes began to fall. Now for a quirky tidbit, some Goths who crossed the Danube were so desperate they traded their children for dog meat when Roman officials botched the relief effort. Imagine standing in a refugee camp, stomach gnawing like a rat, watching corrupt quartermasters hoard grain. That hunger turned into rage, and rage armed itself fast. Historians still argue whether these migrations were the death blow or just accelerants poured on Rome's slow-burning crisis. One school insists the barbarians didn't topple Rome, they integrated, even revitalized it. Another snorts, integration, tell that to the ashes of 410 CE. The truth, as always, drips somewhere between. Rome invited guests to dinner, then forgot the table manners were loaded with daggers. Picture the empire's borders like a dam, hairline cracks spreading under relentless pressure. For centuries, Rome played gatekeeper, recruiting some tribes as foederati, bribing others with gold, and crushing the stubborn few. But when the Huns stormed into Europe like a plague on horseback, the whole dam shuddered. Panic rippled through Germania as tribes stampeded westward, smashing into Roman lines like logs in a flood. And oh, the battlefields. Take Adrianople in 378 CE, a disaster so bad it made Cannae look like a warm-up act. The Eastern Emperor Valens, puffed with overconfidence, faced the Goths without waiting for reinforcements. Result, a Roman army roasted alive on the Thracian plain, Valens himself vanishing in the inferno of a burning farmhouse. Rome had suffered defeats before, but this one was different. It exposed a truth no emperor wanted to admit: the legions were no longer invincible. Here's an aside: after Adrianople, Roman generals whispered the unthinkable, maybe cavalry mattered more than infantry now. Took them long enough. Too bad innovation was moving at glacial speed while the barbarians galloped past on nimble horses. The human tide didn't stop with the Goths. Vandals slashed across Gaul and Spain before hopping into North Africa like it was spring break. Burgundians carved a kingdom along the Rhone. Huns thundered in with Attila at the reins, demanding tribute in gold so hefty it could bankrupt a province. Rome tried treaties, bribes, and marriages. Oh yes, princesses were part of the negotiation package, but these were speed bumps on a highway to chaos. Now imagine the psychological punch. For centuries, Rome was the big kid on the block, the empire that chewed and swallowed entire civilizations. Suddenly, it's the one playing defense. Its emperors cowering behind walls while ragtag tribes dictate terms. By the early 5th century, Western Rome wasn't an empire. It was a landlord negotiating with squatters armed to the teeth. And here's the bitter kicker: many of these tribes didn't even want to destroy Rome. They wanted a slice of its wealth, a patch of its land, a ticket to its world of baths and bread. But the empire, brittle and broke, couldn't absorb them without cracking. Integration turned to invasion, treaties to betrayals, and finally, Alaric's troops marching into Rome itself, sacking a city that once bragged it would outlast eternity. You turn from that misty village now, the wind carrying distant echoes, songs in strange tongues, steel clinking in the dark, the rumble of wagons on frozen ground. It's the sound of nations on the move, driven by hunger, fear, and opportunity. And as you listen, one truth chills your bones: empires don't fall in a single blow. They drown slowly, under waves they thought they could tame. So next time someone mutters, "Rome fell to barbarians," smile and say, "No. Rome opened the door, and the flood walked in." You follow the wind inland now, past abandoned farms and hollowed villas, until a strange stench tickles your nose, a sweet, sickly odor clinging to the cold air. Ahead, in a village square, bodies lie stacked like cordwood, their faces waxy under a winter sun. Doors are barred, shutters nailed, but it's no siege that haunts this place. It's something smaller, swifter, and far deadlier. Welcome to Rome's invisible enemy, the plagues that bled the empire from within, turning strongholds into charnel houses and legions into ghost regiments. Here's the mainstream fact: disease was Rome's silent conqueror. The empire's vast networks, roads, ports, trade hubs, were marvels of connectivity. But they also worked like arteries for pathogens. The Antonine Plague of the 2nd century, likely smallpox, shredded entire armies and may have killed 5 million souls, including an emperor. Then came the Cyprian Plague in the 3rd century, hitting harder, spreading farther, and leaving cities so depopulated that entire neighborhoods vanished under weeds. Now for a quirky tidbit: Bishop Cyprian, whose name got stuck on one of those pandemics, described victims with bowels in continuous flux, limbs dissolving into slime. Sounds like a bad metal lyric, but that's an actual ancient account. His sermons framed it as a spiritual wake-up call, but for Rome, it was a biological wrecking ball. Historians still argue how decisive these plagues were. Some shrug and say, sure, nasty, but empires survive bad years. Others claim pandemics were Rome's real death sentence, slicing its population by a third, gutting tax revenues, and hollowing out armies long before barbarians showed up. One truth stands solid: disease didn't just kill bodies, it shredded morale, faith, and infrastructure in ways swords never could. Picture this: a Roman camp on the Danube frontier, snow crunching under boots, soldiers shivering not from cold but fever, the sick slump in their tents, their shields stacked outside like gravestones. Officers burn incense, whisper prayers, sacrifice goats, anything to placate angry gods. But the smoke does nothing. The ranks thin by the hour, and when the next barbarian raid comes, the defense line looks like a comb missing half its teeth. And cities, worse, Rome itself, crowded, filthy, teeming with humanity, became a petri dish. Sewage clogged drains, rats scurried, fleas feasted, public baths, those gleaming marvels of Roman leisure, turned into germ buffets. Even emperors weren't safe. Marcus Aurelius died in a plague-stricken camp. A philosopher king fell not by war but by a microbe. Irony loves good timing. Here's an aside: imagine Instagram during these plagues: empty amphitheaters, ghostly forums, influencers posting, "Stay safe." Citizens #Pax Deorum, while stockpiling grain in their villas. Ancient pandemics didn't trend, but they rewrote economies and power maps all the same. And disease wasn't just a killer, it was a saboteur. With fewer taxpayers, the state jacked up rates on survivors, squeezing them like overripe figs. Farmers abandoned fields, cities shrank, trade sputtered, and military recruitment became a farce. Whole provinces turned skeletal. Imagine North Africa, once Rome's breadbasket, now struggling to feed its own ghosts. The psychological fallout was savage. When plagues hit, Romans didn't know germs from genies. They saw omens, gods furious, Christians cursed, fate collapsing, pogroms flared, scapegoats burned. Christianity oddly thrived here, offering comfort and care networks when the old gods stayed mute. Some historians argue that these pandemics, grim as they were, greased the cultural rails for Christianity's rise. But let's not romanticize it. Plague didn't purify Rome, it poisoned it. The empire staggered under demographic loss like a boxer bleeding out mid-ring. Combine disease with famine, war, and political chaos, and you've got the apocalypse in a toga. You turn from the silent square now, boots crunching over frost while crows wheel above, black against a grey sky. Behind you, shuttered homes creak like coffins. Ahead, the road winds toward a capital gasping for breath, its heartbeat slowing under invisible chains. Rome didn't fall in battle today, it fell in fever. So next time someone says barbarians brought down the empire, murmur this: some of Rome's fiercest enemies couldn't even hold a sword, they traveled in droplets, clung to fleas, and laughed at marble walls. You climb a hill now, the cold biting sharper as you near a cluster of battered watchtowers. From up here, you can see the bones of empire stretching to the horizon, abandoned farms like grey scars, smoke curling from distant fires, and walls, so many walls, snaking across the land like stone bandages. And yet, for all this stone and sweat, Rome still bleeds. Welcome to the illusion of security, the empire that tried to wall itself in and, in doing so, trapped its own doom. Here's the mainstream fact: Rome spent staggering sums on fortifications during its final centuries. The famous limes on the Rhine and Danube, Hadrian's Wall up in misty Britannia, and later, massive urban defenses like Aurelian's Wall in Rome itself, each a desperate shrug against growing chaos. By the 3rd century, walls sprouted like weeds around provincial towns. It was a clear shift. An empire built on offense was now obsessed with defense. The wolf had become a hedgehog. Now for a quirky tidbit: when Aurelian threw up his 12-mile wall around Rome in the 270s, it wasn't a proud project, it was panic in bricks. Imagine emperors telling citizens for centuries, "We are invincible," and then, suddenly, "Hey, let's build a massive wall because, just in case." That's not confidence, it's cold sweat in stone form. Historians still argue whether these fortifications prolonged Rome's life or choked it. Sure, walls slowed raids, but they also screened vulnerability, invited siege warfare, and devoured resources that could have funded mobile armies or economic recovery. Every mile of stone was a mile of treasury hemorrhage, and walls don't grow wheat or recruit soldiers. You picture the empire as a once muscular athlete now hunched under armor so heavy he can barely move. The old strategy, swift strikes, aggressive diplomacy, gave way to bunker mentality. Garrison troops huddled in forts, watching smoke on the horizon, too scattered to reinforce each other fast. When enemies breached one point, entire regions fell like dominoes. And these weren't just physical walls, they mirrored a mental shift. Rome stopped thinking like a predator and started thinking like prey. That change rippled through policy, art, even language. Imperial propaganda toned down its thunder, focusing on survival, not supremacy. Rome wasn't promising eternal dominion anymore. It was promising not to collapse, yet. Here's the irony: walls that once defined civilization's edge now caged decline. Cities behind ramparts turned inward. Economies stagnated. Trade shriveled. Those glorious Roman roads you admired in Section 6. Many became useless as merchants feared the no-man's land between fortified towns. Imagine a modern superhighway where no one dares drive because bandits own the exits. And about those bandits, some were former soldiers gone rogue. Their pay in arrears. Their loyalty sold to the highest bidder. Others were barbarian warbands slipping through cracks Rome couldn't plug, bypassing walls to strike soft targets. Because here's a lesson Rome forgot: walls don't work when threats come from everywhere, and sometimes from inside. Now step closer to this watchtower. See the graffiti scrawled by bored sentries. Crude jokes, scratched prayers, names of lovers left behind. These walls were monuments to anxiety, not confidence. And the soldiers manning them knew it. They weren't guarding an empire, they were nursing its slow collapse. One frostbitten night at a time. Here's an aside: picture a modern corporation hemorrhaging profit, pouring billions into cybersecurity while ignoring its dying product line. That's Rome with walls, treating symptoms, not causes. By the 5th century, some towns walled themselves off so tightly they strangled their own economies. Peasants fled to fortified centers. abandoning farmland, grain shortages deepened, tax revenues tanked, and armies starved, all because the empire thought safety meant stone. You leave the towers now, boots crunching on frosty gravel, the wind howling through arrow slits like a ghost's laugh. Behind you, walls loom, mute, colossal, futile. Ahead, the dark horizon hides riders, raiders, and storms Rome cannot stop. So next time someone praises the brilliance of Roman engineering, smile and say, their walls were perfect, but they were building them for the wrong enemy. The wind has teeth now, gnawing at your cloak as you descend into a valley scattered with villas, grand ones. But now husks of their former glory. Roof tiles slide into weeds. Statues lean drunkenly in overgrown gardens. And the air tastes of damp neglect. Somewhere in this quiet ruin lies a truth sharper than any sword, wealth concentrated like molten gold in the hands of a few, while the empire's foundations cracked under the weight of its own inequality. Here's the mainstream fact: by the later centuries, Rome's economy looked less like a robust network and more like a pyramid scheme with better architecture. The senatorial and equestrian elites hoarded land, gobbled estates, and dodged taxes through loopholes wide enough to drive a chariot through. Meanwhile, small farmers, the empire's backbone, snapped like brittle twigs under mounting tax burdens. When harvests failed or collectors squeezed too hard, these peasants didn't fight, they fled, abandoning fields to seek refuge under the wings of the rich as coloni. Tenant farmers chained to estates like shadows. Sound familiar? That's feudalism in its larval stage. Now for a quirky tidbit: some senators were so rich they owned estates larger than entire provinces, with their own private militias, courts, and marble-stuffed dining halls. They dined on peacock tongues while villagers outside their gates gnawed on despair. And if you think tax evasion is a modern sport, think again. These guys wrote the rulebook. They bribed officials, forged exemptions, and sometimes gifted land to the church just to dodge imperial levies. Historians still argue whether this wealth gap toppled Rome or merely greased its slide. Some claim fiscal inequality choked military funding and hollowed cities, others shrug, pointing out that elites have been greedy since goats learned to bleat. But when you pile aristocratic excess onto plagues, invasions, and climate chaos, the weight becomes unbearable. Picture the empire's tax system like a vampire that refused to change its diet. With elites wriggling free, the burden sank its fangs into middling farmers and urban plebs. Desperate officials squeezed harder, pushing productive families off their land, which meant fewer crops, which meant, you guessed it, higher taxes for those left standing. It was an economic death spiral disguised as policy. And here's the irony: these elites, fattened on privilege, were the very people the state needed most. Educated, connected, resource-rich, they could have been pillars of resilience. Instead, many became termites, hollowing beams while the roof sagged. Some even hoarded grain during famines to inflate prices. Imagine strolling past a granary bursting with wheat while your child starves on the roadside. Civilized, right? An aside for flavor, Roman moralists loved wagging fingers at decadence, those scandalous feasts where nobles served dormice dipped in honey. But here's the real obscenity: while senators argued philosophy over jeweled goblets, soldiers at the Rhine froze in patched cloaks, their pay months late because the treasury bled dry. Luxury became a war crime in slow motion. And when barbarians breached the gates, these grandees didn't rally the legions, they negotiated private deals, retreating to fortified estates or bribing raiders with gold siphoned from the empire's marrow. Loyalty became another commodity, and patriotism, a quaint joke whispered in marble halls. You wander now through the skeleton of a villa, crunching mosaics underfoot, past frescoes faded like old sighs. In one corner, a cracked inscription proclaims Fortuna Domus, fortune of the house. The fortune's gone, the house a tomb, but the message lingers. Wealth can buy walls, but not time. So next time someone romanticizes Rome's grandeur, remind them, behind the marble masks, rot pooled in silence, because when the few feast and the many starve, even an empire of stone can crumble like stale bread. The path curves toward a hilltop now, where the ruins of a basilica rise like broken teeth against the pale sky. Inside, candles flicker before a rough-hewn altar. The glow soft against mosaic fragments that once blazed in color. You step into the cool hush and feel the weight of something invisible, belief. Reshaping the bones of empire. Tonight, we linger with a cause less bloody yet no less seismic, how shifting faith fractured Rome's foundations, even as it promised salvation. Here's the mainstream fact. In the 4th century, Christianity went from persecuted fringe to state religion faster than you can say, Constantine. The Edict of Milan in 313 legalized Christian worship. By the century's end, Theodosius slammed the door on pagan rites, turning Rome's old gods into museum pieces. What began in catacombs ended in cathedrals, and the empire would never govern the same way again. Now for a quirky tidbit, some senators clung to pagan traditions like stubborn party guests who refused to leave. Even in the 390s, aristocrats held clandestine sacrifices in their villas, sprinkling wine and muttering prayers to Jupiter while publicly professing Christian piety. Think of it as Rome's awkward, in-between, phase, a cultural mullet, Christian in front, pagan in the back. Historians still argue whether this religious revolution saved or sabotaged the empire. Did Christianity provide unity in chaos, or divide loyalty between heaven and earth? One camp says it gave Rome moral glue, another insists it dissolved civic duty like salt in wine. After all, the old system tied religion to the state, rituals, festivals, imperial cults binding citizens to Rome. Christianity broke that bond, redirecting allegiance from emperor to eternity. Picture a legionary in Gaul circa 410 CE, hearing priests preach that the kingdom of heaven matters more than earthly thrones. Great for spiritual comfort, terrible for recruitment posters. Pagan Rome fought for Roma Aeterna, the eternal city. Christian Rome fought for souls, not soil. And while bishops preached humility, generals begged for soldiers. Guess which message filled pews instead of ranks? And money. Follow the coin. Pagan temples once funneled wealth into civic projects, baths, theaters, roads. When Christianity rose, resources flowed into churches, monasteries, and elaborate saintly relics. Useful for faith, less so for frontier defense. Plus, the church earned tax exemptions, sweet relief for clergy, bitter poison for imperial ledgers already bleeding from plagues and corruption. Here's the irony: the faith that promised unity sparked fresh divisions. Arianism split Christians over Christ's nature, Donatists warred in Africa, councils flared like family feuds at every doctrinal snag. Some bishops wielded more clout than generals, and emperors found themselves refereeing theology instead of strategy. Imagine your empire crumbling while you're stuck moderating a debate on the Trinity. An aside, Augustine of Hippo penned his City of God after Rome's sack in 410. Soothing believers that earthly kingdoms fall but God's city stands eternal. Comforting words, if you weren't one of the Romans watching your silverware carted off by Goths. And pagan backlash. Oh, it simmered. When disasters struck, whispers blamed Christians for angering the old gods. Even the historian Zosimus grumbled that ditching Jupiter doomed Rome. Was he wrong? Historians still shrug and argue. You move deeper into the basilica, past cracked columns and shattered saints. Candles hiss in pools of wax. And above, a shaft of light pierces the gloom like grace breaking through ruin. Christianity didn't topple Rome single-handedly, but it rewired its nervous system, turning the empire's gaze from earth to heaven while the ground cracked beneath its sandals. So next time someone calls faith a private affair, recall this: belief can redraw maps, reroute empires, and leave marble gods staring blind into the dust. You step out of the basilica into a world sagging under its own weight. The air feels different now, quieter, as if the Empire's heartbeat has slowed to a faint murmur. Ahead, the road splits, its stones worn smooth by centuries of sandals and hooves. But no caravans rumble here anymore. You walk on, boots tapping like a metronome for history's final, faltering measures. And tonight, we linger on the strangest culprit of all: sheer, unrelenting overreach, a Rome stretched so thin it became a ghost of itself before the barbarians even touched the gates. Here's the mainstream fact: by its zenith in the 2nd century, Rome sprawled across 3 continents, hugging seas like a smug colossus. But glory came with a bill. Those vast frontiers, Rhine, Danube, Sahara, Syrian deserts, needed walls, forts, roads, garrisons, governors, tax collectors, and an army of bureaucrats just to hum along. That humming, however, cost a fortune, and as expansion stalled, fresh plunder dried up. What had been a self-funding war machine became a static beast eating its own tail. Now for a quirky tidbit: the imperial post system alone, the cursus publicus, nearly bankrupted provinces. Imagine maintaining relay stations across thousands of miles so some minor official could gallop with bad news about a tax shortfall. Add soldiers demanding pay in gold, not grain, civil servants greasing palms like it was an Olympic event, and you have an empire running on fumes but guzzling like a chariot with a hole in the wine jar. Historians still argue whether overreach was inevitable genius, better too big than too small, or slow-motion suicide. Some hail Diocletian's reforms as lifesavers, slicing the empire into smaller dioceses, beefing bureaucracy, doubling armies. Others counter that those fixes were like slapping more scaffolding on a collapsing building. Sure, the structure stood, but groaning, swaying, creaking with every breeze. Picture Rome as a sprawling estate whose owners keep adding wings while the foundation buckles. Outposts in Britain, fortresses in Mesopotamia, fleets on the Nile, each flashing like a jewel, each bleeding coin and men. When crises hit, plagues, famines, invasions, the empire couldn't pivot. Its size, once its pride, became a death sentence of logistics. Troops shuffled like exhausted chess pieces, never where they were needed. Roads cracked, bridges sagged, and imperial messengers cursed every mountain pass between Antioch and Ravenna. And the emperors, poor devils, they raced the map like desperate caretakers, stamping out fires with sandals soaked in oil. Some split power, 2 emperors, then 4, hoping collegial rule would calm the storm. Instead, civil wars flared like summer lightning. Because here's the secret rot: when an empire's too big to defend, the real enemy isn't just outside, it's inside, whispering ambition in every general's ear. An aside for irony, Roman writers once bragged that all roads lead to Rome. By the 5th century, all roads led to trouble: tax collectors, marauders, mutinies. If hashtags existed, hashtag too big to survive would have trended hard. And yet, the empire didn't collapse in a cinematic bang. It frayed, thread by thread. Governors ruled like kings in distant provinces. Grain fleets stopped sailing. Legions in Britain packed up and ghosted the island. The western capital moved from Rome to Ravenna, a retreat behind marshes. Like a hermit crab scuttling into a smaller shell. Now pause. Listen. In the dusk, you hear nothing. No rumble of legions. No roar of markets. Only the sigh of wind over stones. The empire that once called itself eternal has learned the cruelest truth: eternity is expensive. So next time someone says Rome fell, shake your head. It didn't topple, it withered, sprawling too far for its own pulse to reach its limbs. And when the axe finally swung, Odoacer booting the last Western emperor in 476, it was almost an afterthought. The giant had died standing, eyes on horizons it could no longer touch. And now, friend, let the dust settle. You've walked through fields that turned to deserts, cities gnawed by silence, and halls where power once swaggered like a god. You've felt plagues whisper through crowded streets, watched barbarians ride like storms, and seen faith bend empires to its quiet will. You've traced cracks too fine for glory to notice, until the marble split and the statues toppled. Close your eyes and hold the picture, twilight over the forum. Weeds curling through broken columns. A stray breeze lifting scraps of faded fresco from a villa floor. No armies clash here now. No senators strut in purple. Only the hum of cicadas and the soft, eternal hush of stone giving into time. And maybe, just maybe, you feel something soothing in that surrender. Because even Rome, the great, the terrible, the eternal, could not outshout the centuries. Its fall was not a single scream, but a long exhale, drifting over hills, carried by rivers, scattered like ash into the soil of new worlds. So, dim your screen for a moment. Let that thought linger like incense in an empty temple, that every empire, every colossus, every towering dream shares the same fragile heartbeat as ours. And in the quiet beyond collapse, life still hums, a wildflower pushing through marble, a bird nesting in a shattered arch, a whisper that says, all things end. And in that ending, there's a kind of peace. Sleep well, traveler. The ruins will keep their secrets till morning.